ألف لام ميم تلك آيات الكتاب لهم عذاب مهين وإذا تتلى عليه آياتنا ولى مستكبرا كأن لم يسمعها كأن في أذنيه وقرا فبشره بعذاب أليم إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم جنات النعيم خالدين فيها وعد الله حقا وهو العزيز الحكيم خلق السماوات بغير عمد ترونها وألقى في الأرض رواسي أن تميد بكم وبث فيها من كل دابة وأنزلنا من السماء ماء فأنبتنا فيها من كل زوج كريم هذا خلق الله فأروني ماذا خلق الذين من دونه هذا خلق الله فأروني ماذا خلق الذين من دونه بل الظالمون في ضلال مبين صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله الكريم وإنما نحن مع ذلك لمن الصادقين صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Their ears. So give them good news, O Prophet, of a painful punishment. Surely those who believe and do good will have the gardens of bliss, staying there forever. Allah's promise is true, and He is the Almighty, the All-Wise. He created the heavens without pillars, as you can see, and placed firm mountains upon the earth so it does not shake with you, and scattered throughout it all types of creatures. And we send down rain from the sky, causing every type of fine plant to grow on the earth. That is Allah's creation. Now show me what those gods other than Him have created. In fact, the wrongdoers are clearly astray. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim.
Today we're very fortunate to have Assistant Professor Dr Miqdad Asaria speaking to us on the health of minority ethnic communities in the UK, healthy migrants, salmon and the social determinants of health. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. For those who don't know Miqdad Asaria, he's a health economist with extensive experience in both academic and policy-making settings. His research interests include health inequalities and health financing, with a particular focus on the health systems in India and the UK. He currently holds a fellowship from the Health Foundation to investigate the contribution of austerity policies to racial and socioeconomic health inequalities, and he employs methods, and prior to working at the LSE, he worked with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in India, the Centre for Health Economics at the University of York, and the Department of Health in the UK. You can find out more on the LSE website. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Where did it go? Display. Updated itself, is it?
It's there in the back, no? So it's doing this. It's being clever. What if we do this use as separate display? Just close this here. Oops. That's not what we wanted to do. 1080, right? Okay. And now
I'm using my computer for videos.
use slideshow, right? I think as soon as
Is it on presenter view? Can you turn presenter view on?
how do you do that?
I don't know how to do that.
I think it thinks we have two screens. That's different. What about if I do this? Use a separate display. Where's my mouse gone? No.
I'm going to give you my first laptop.
Okay.
USB.
No. Can you put me on Wi-Fi and I can just email it to you?
I've got you.
Okay. Do you have a, can I plug my, what am I saying? Can I put the presentation across? Because I've changed it a little bit. Do you have a thing? It goes directly, is it?
Sorry for the technical difficulties. We're going to start the program now, I think. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Okay, thank you so much. Apologies for the technical difficulties. So the talk today will be about the health of minority ethnic communities in the UK. And as many of you know, throughout, particularly in recent times, throughout COVID, there's been a lot of concern about what's happening to the ethnic minority communities in this country, and why is it? Why are they being affected differently to other groups during COVID? And this is the kind of thing that you often see in America, where they talk about the health of black people and the health of Latino people and the health of white people. But normally in the UK, when we're thinking about health differences or health inequalities, we don't really think about different groups of people like that. We think about the health of poor people and the health of rich people. And so with COVID, we've started to think in this way as well, because we've seen some quite big differences. So I'm going to talk about various different reasons why the health of different groups might be vary in the country, right? And so let's have a look. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by ethnic minorities or ethnic groups, and how could we interpret some of these things and understand them. Then we'll talk a little bit about life expectancy and how life expectancy varies for the different groups in the UK and what the data tells us. And we'll talk about some reasons why that might be. And then we'll talk about what we saw during COVID and why some of those things might be. So let's start with ethnicity. And what do we mean by ethnicity? And particularly in a UK context, what do we mean by ethnicity, right? And so I think it's important just to remember that Britain was an empire, right? From 1583 till 1997, there was this huge British Empire, and by that it was almost like Britain was this big country that was spread all over the world, and most of us, all of us actually, probably come from one of these parts of the world that was part of the British Empire, right? And so the fact that we're here is not a coincidence, or it's not just by chance. We're here because we have some historical connection with this British Empire, right? And you can see many parts of Africa and India and parts of the Arab world were all part of this empire, right? And so the reason why we're here is no big surprise. And apart from perhaps the Eastern Europeans, who form another big group, all the rest of the immigrants really are from this empire, right? And so if we think about who are these big groups in the population, So approximately 15% of the population in the last census were non-white, okay? Of those, 2.5% were Indian, about 2% were Pakistani, 1% were Caribbean, and almost 1% were Bangladeshi, and the remainder were a whole range of other Africans and Asians and Arabs and different ethnicities, okay? And if we think about when these people came to the country, right, there are actually some key waves of migration where people came to the country from outside. So before, the 1950s or so, there was still this big British Empire, and actually the British Empire meant that English people from England went out to other parts of the world and treated them as their own country and took back the wealth. But very rarely people from other parts of the world had come and stayed in England, right? And so, but as the empire ended, this changed, right? And so there was, of course, the Second World War, and after the Second World War, the empire kind of collapsed, and many of the soldiers who fought in the wars for England were from the empire, so there was many Indian and Pakistani soldiers, there was many soldiers from Africa who fought in those wars, and some of them stayed with the army back in England after those wars, right? The other big thing that happened after the war is that they created the NHS in this country after the war. And so suddenly they had this big health system and they needed staff to work in that health system. And so they had to recruit staff from all over the world. And primarily that means from the empire to come and work in England. And at that time, everybody in the British Empire had a right to a British passport, would be able to come and live in England. There wasn't any, it was like one big country at that point, right? And so we saw one big, quite prominent move was the Caribbean population who arrived in the late 1940s. So we know these as the Windrush generation after the name of one of those boats that came in, right? And we've seen a lot of controversy recently about these Windrush people and how they've been treated and how they've been suddenly denied British citizenship after being here for 50, 60, 70 years, right? Then there was this interesting event that happened in Kashmir where they built this dam, this Mangla Dam in a village called Mirpur, and it flooded the village, and a lot of those people were given permission or rights to migrate to England. So you find actually there's a big Pakistani community in England, but actually a lot of them come from this one area of Kashmir from this period. And you'll find a surprisingly large number of these Pakistani people wouldn't speak Urdu, wouldn't be Pakistani in the sense that you might imagine, but that's what we mean when we say Pakistani for a lot of the people. And they came in the 60s, right? And then, of course, there was the war between the different parts of Pakistan where Bangladesh became independent from Pakistan. And in the data, we see a lot of Bangladeshis appear in the 70s. Now, whether that's because they came after the war or whether because before the 70s there was no such country as Bangladesh, so you couldn't say somebody was from Bangladesh, it's hard to interpret. But definitely after the 70s, you see a big group of Bangladeshis. And then, of course, you have a big Indian expulsion from Uganda and the surrounding countries. Also, people started coming when they got worried about being able to live in Africa. So the Indians that the British had taken to Africa suddenly found that they were no more welcome in East Africa, and so they came also to the UK. And so these are four of the big groups who formed the migrants and why they came. Then, of course, later on, there was various migrations from Iraq, from after Saddam Hussein, or from Afghanistan, or from Somalia, so various other countries where these big kind of influx of refugees came in, right? And so this is an interesting book, and I think the title is quite nice here. There's a very recent book. It says, "We are here because you were there." It's no coincidence that we are here. We are here because the English people came to our countries. That's why it's us that are here, not... There's a whole range of other people, like South Americans and others, that are more likely to have gone to Spain or Portugal or other countries, whereas us specifically are here because the English went to our countries. So let's start by thinking about life expectancy, and let's have a quick quiz. So if we think about all the different groups of people in this country, and we think about the white English people, do we think the white English people live on average longer than all the other groups or shorter than all the other groups? So who thinks longer? Who thinks the white English people think longer than everybody, live longer than everybody else? Yeah, most people are saying the white English people live longer than everybody else. And actually this is quite difficult to find out, because the way we find out how long people live is we look at their death certificates, right? And we think about when did they die. And in England, until very recently, I'm not sure if this has changed yet, but it's something that they've been wanting to change. But until very recently, we haven't been recording people's ethnic background when they on their death certificate, right? So we don't know which ethnic group they're in when they died. But recently, what they've done is they've managed to collect the mortality data, those death records, and link them to census records. And if you remember, when you filled in your census form earlier this year, you had to say what ethnicity you were. And so once they can link those together, they can find out what ethnicity people were when they died, right? And so this has just come out in the last few months, where they did these calculations to say how long on average do people live? What is the life expectancy of different groups? And you might be surprised to see that the white people in this country have the shortest life expectancy for both males and females compared to every other group, right? Every other group on average lives longer than white English people, right? So why could that be? How could that be? So let's start thinking about that, right? But you can see it's quite a big, it's not small differences, right? You can see like black African women living almost 90 years compared to 83 years for white English women. And we're not only talking about poor, deprived, red wall communities here. We're talking about the average across all of the white English people, right? So that's quite a shockingly large difference, right? And you can see that perhaps not what you would have expected, yeah? So I'm afraid we have to look at a little bit of maths to understand what do we mean by life expectancy. Okay, so when we calculate life expectancy, we start by thinking about what's the chances that somebody in a particular age group died. And so we look at, for every age group, so if we look at like 60-year-olds, we look at how many 60-year-olds were alive at the beginning of the year, and by the end of the year, how many 60-year-olds died. And that gives us a likelihood that a 60-year-old would have died that particular year. And we do that for every single age group. And then that gives us a kind of a sense of how likely is it that anybody died in any age group, right? And then if we think about what is life expectancy, well, life expectancy is just the opposite of that. It's how likely is it that you didn't die. So we take an average of all of those different age groups and saying how likely is it that you lived for that year, and that average gives us a measure of life expectancy. Okay, so we have these two key components: your chances of dying in that particular year and the chance that you were alive. How many of you were alive at that particular year, right? Those are the two things. Now, the actual calculation is a little bit more complicated than this, but essentially this is what's going on. Okay, so what could be going wrong here? So actually, for those people following online, we're going to go through a few video clips in this presentation just to explain some of what's going on. And one of the key things that's going on is the difference between the types of people who migrate and don't migrate. So we have this idea of healthy migrants. So I want to go to the first video clip, Sajjad, if possible. And those on YouTube, I think Sajjad has put some links at the description of the video. So this is the video 1 there.
Year-old Noor Ammar lost her father and her home in the Syrian
think about who are migrants, who are these refugees, we feel sorry for them. We think that they must be really sick, really poor, really hungry, really frail kind of people, right? But as we can see in this video, Noor here had to make a very long and hard journey, a very long, hard, and expensive journey. She had to be able to speak many languages, navigate many different situations, be quite creative, so she's clearly rich, educated, young, healthy. Imagine if she didn't have 3,000 euros. Would she be able to make that journey? Imagine if she didn't know how to navigate different transport systems, if she didn't know how to bribe a police, how to do this, how to speak English. Maybe she also speaks Swedish. She's gone to Sweden. She speaks Arabic, obviously. Imagine if she had cancer, or if she had diabetes, or she had some kind of chronic condition where she needed to be constantly taking medication. Could she make that journey? So obviously not, right? So often you find that migrants are not the average people from the countries that they come from. Migrants are much healthier, much more privileged, much more, they have a very good chance of doing well, right? Because actually anybody who was sick probably wouldn't have made it on that journey. Either they wouldn't have started, or they might have died along the way, right? Because these journeys are not easy to make, right? She was traveling non-stop for 2 weeks. It's quite a major achievement, right? So often you find in many countries that when migrants first come, they're not the average people from their countries. They're much more healthy than the average people from their countries, right? So we find that, they're often younger, healthier, wealthier, better educated, right? And so obviously you think that they are probably going to live longer than other people, right? Because they don't have any sickness. They've had a very good start in life. All the research tells us that actually what really matters is your first few years of life. And if you do really well in your first few years of life, probably things will go well for you for the rest of your life, right? So they've had all of those advantages, right? So if we come back to our equation, we can see in the top here, the chances of them dying are going to be smaller, right? So their life expectancy will be longer because actually there's less chance that they'll be dying, okay? So now let's look at the next thing. So salmon. So why have we talked about salmon here? So Sajjad, if you can play the second video. This happens even within countries. So if you go to places like India or China, you find huge amounts of internal migration as well. So people move from their villages to the cities to go and make their livings. People move around the world. Lots of people go to the Gulf. Lots of people come here to find jobs, but nobody wants to die here. People don't come here long term. So you often see people come here, they collect money, they send it home, they build a house in their village, or they send home money to their families. But as they're getting older and as they're retiring, they don't want to stay here anymore. There's nothing for them here, and many people end up going back. Or the situation in their country resolves, Saddam Hussein leaves, or Somalia gets peace, or all of these things can happen, and so people start to go back again. And so they start to go back, and so what you find is that they don't die in this country. And the way we calculate life expectancy is we look at who dies in this country, right? So like we said, like salmon, people often go back to where they were born when they want to die, right? Because that's where they feel most comfortable and where they want to retire, right? And one of the big problems here is when we calculate these life expectancy, we want to find out, we had two things in our equation: the number of people who died and the number of people who are alive right now in the country, right? And so for these people, we don't see they die because they went to another country and they died back in their other country. But we assume they're still alive because they didn't die, and the last time we looked, they were alive. And we only look every 10 years when we do a census. So for 10 years, up to 10 years, we're out of date with our results, right? So we think they're still alive. And so we think that actually very few people from this community are dying because nobody's dying, they're all still here. But actually, they're not still here, they've gone, and many of them have gone and they've died somewhere else. And we don't realize that until 10 years later. And we still don't realize they've died. We just see, there's a different number of people, but we don't ever actually say that actually these people died, right? And so we underestimate their chances of dying. So again, we overestimate their life expectancy. So this is something we call salmon bias, right? So why do we call these things biases? What do we mean by bias, right? So for those of you who are not mathematicians, a bias is where you kind of estimate something wrong, right? You're kind of saying that you're systematically wrong. You're getting the answer wrong when you're doing your calculation. And why are you getting your answer wrong, right? So it's not because of the person's ethnicity. It's not because you're Pakistani or you're Indian or you're Iraqi or you're Somali that your life expectancy is higher than an English white person's. There's something else going on. These other things are skewing your calculation, and we're misled in our calculation by the fact that the people who migrate are already healthier than the average people. So we've got this healthy migrant bias, right? And that people often go back home to die. So we've got this salmon bias. So our calculation of life expectancy for migrants is biased, right? And because of both of these factors, we think that people from these groups are living longer than maybe the average person from that group is living, right? Now, these biases are of course true for first-generation migrants, right? Now, some of you are second-generation migrants. So you are not any more healthy than the average white English person, unfortunately. There's nothing that means that you're more healthy than the average white English person. And you're not necessarily more likely to go back anywhere else to die because this is the only place you know, right? So this doesn't necessarily apply to you if you're a second-generation migrant, okay? So we think about all of this, and then let's think about COVID. Yeah? What happened during COVID? So maybe all of this doesn't look familiar to you because what you've seen is what happened during COVID, and what happened during COVID was something quite different, right? So what happened during COVID, we saw that black women were 4.3 times as likely to die as white women, black men 4.2 times as likely, Pakistani and Bangladeshis, almost the same, 3 and 4 times as likely. And these were the age-adjusted figures for the first wave of the pandemic. Okay, so this is probably the reason why you thought at the beginning that people who are the non-white people will have lower life expectancy than the white English people, right? Because of all of these reasons, right? Because of the kinds of jobs people do, because of how they're treated, because of the places they live, and all of these things, right? And those things we call the social determinants of health, right? So we can think about health. You know, when you often think about health, people think some people are healthy or more or less healthy because they have access to medicine and access to doctors, right? But actually, by the time you go to a doctor, you're already sick. It's not the doctor that makes you healthy or not healthy. It's the doctor that maybe stops you from dying. But by that time, it's too late, right? So what you really want to do is you don't want to get sick in the first place. And to not get sick in the first place, there's all of these other things that are really important. So your education, where you live, where you work, your access to exercise, your access to community, all of these things, right, can really shape your chances of getting sick. And then finally, you know, it might be that once you've got sick, you might have different access to healthcare. But really, it's all of these other things that are really important in society. And what we've seen in COVID is that non-white people have much worse social determinants of health in all sorts of ways. And we're all familiar with this, right? We can see, I mean, there's lots of examples that you can see around housing, around Grenfell, around Prevent in schools and how Muslim children are treated, around how the Windrush scandal and how the Caribbean community has been treated. We've seen in sports with the cricket thing that's been going on. We've seen in every area of life, you can see that they have done all sorts of research around job applicants, insurance, you name it. You know, like Miqdad Asaria has documented thousands of things. Every day you can see on his social media more and more things where various people are discriminated against in different parts of life, right? And you can see this has been quite a key part of policy in this country as well. It's not just people are discriminating, but the government from the top has been discriminating through things like its Brexit campaigning, and you can see Theresa May's sending immigrants home. And so they create this environment which is quite toxic and quite damaging to people's life chances, which in turn ends up being damaging to their health, right? And so one of the ways you can think about this is in terms of how the kind of areas that people live in, and do they live in deprived areas or not deprived areas. And so in this graph I've shown the least deprived to the most deprived. So basically the richest parts of the country to the poorest parts of the country, and the yellow bars show the white people. So you can see the white people are pretty much equally distributed in all areas. They're spread evenly around the country. And the blue bars are the non-white people. And you can see the non-white people are really concentrated in the poorer areas, right? Non-white people live in these poorer areas. And by poorer areas, we mean areas which have poor housing, lots of air pollution, high crime rates, poor employment rates. So all of these things are like clustered in these areas. That's what we mean by deprived areas, right? So it's measured by this thing called the index of multiple deprivation that combines a lot of these different things. And so we can see that actually the social determinants of health are much worse for these people, right? I think we can do this video. It's quite an interesting little experiment that they did in the US, showing that how you treat people really changes how they do themselves, right? So Sajjad, let's do this video and then we can stop there, I think. there, that it's, often people say, oh, this discrimination, it's about, you just have to get over it, you just ignore people, it's okay, it's fine. You might be, prevented from certain things, but you just work harder, you'll be fine, right? But you can see that these people, these kids who are just told one day that you've got this color eyes, therefore you're worse, and suddenly just because they were told they're worse, they did worse in the exam. Not because somebody marked them down, not because somebody said, oh, you've got brown eyes, that's why I'll give you less marks, because they were told they were worse and they performed worse, right? Now you can imagine all of these immigrant children in this country who are at school treated worse than others by a system that tells them, you're worse, you're terrorists, you're dangerous, you're this, you're that. How are they growing up? How are they performing? If they do worse at school, is it because they're more stupid, or is it because they've been told that they're more stupid? So some of these things are really quite thought-provoking, right? And so this was an interesting experiment that this teacher did with her class the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So she was so upset by the assassination, so she wanted to teach the kids the value of discrimination, right? And so we've seen that these ideas like discrimination and the social determinants of health mean that actually people are more likely to die if they're from non-white groups, right? And so coming back to our equation, suddenly we find that this will make their life expectancies lower, right? And so now for the first, so in summary, right? So life expectancy, we know for now is higher for ethnic minorities. And we can largely explain this from this healthy migrant and salmon biases. There may be some other things around behaviors that migrant groups often drink less alcohol, smoke less, things like that. So there may be certain behaviors that help to explain that, but largely you can explain with these things. But we can see that social determinants of health are systematically worse for minority ethnic communities, and some people call this structural racism, right? They say that the system is set up in a way that they will do worse in various ways, and that will then actually lead to poor health in these communities, right? So, and that's meant that minority ethnic communities have had worse impacts, especially in COVID, we've seen that, right? And it's likely that life expectancy for second generation migrants in the UK won't follow the same pattern as first. So we don't necessarily think that for people who are born here, they'll do better than the average white person. Actually, all the evidence would suggest that they will do worse on average, okay? Because of these differences in the social determinants of health, right? So they have all of that downward pressure on their life expectancy, and they don't have those healthy migrant and salmon biases that we've talked about. Now, that doesn't mean that all non-white people do badly, or like we know our clown here and his friends. So if you're nice enough and morally flexible enough, you can do quite well in this country, right? Some of these people no longer are so prominent as you can notice, right? So in summary, the future looks pretty grim for us, right? But at least we know it will be short.
Thank you very much. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We have time for some questions. Is there any questions from either side? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. There was just something which drew my eye. 4 big waves of migration. One in the post-war period, 70 years ago. One in the 1950s, 60 years ago. One in the 1970s, 50 years ago. Anyone in their 20s coming over at that point in time, at their youngest, would be in their 70s now. And the social determinants of health that you describe long predate COVID. How is it that those social determinants that you've quite nicely mapped onto the mortality in COVID do not map or explain the life expectancy issue?
Thank you for the question. So I think, so as you pointed out, many of those people are still fairly young. They're still in their 70s. a lot of those people. A 20-year-old who had came 50 years ago in the 70s. So most immigrants haven't lived to the point where they're naturally dying. Now we're starting to see, seeing some of the older people dying. So it's still early days actually to make any kind of, so for the Caribbean community, they've been here a bit longer, and so we can make a bit more of an accurate assessment of how they're dying. So one of the, we don't know how long people will actually live. The other thing is that so the social determinants of health create pressure on life expectancy, and the healthy migrant bias, the salmon bias, creates the upward pressure on the, and those two things might be cancelling out, or actually the upwards factors are outweighing the downwards factors for those groups, and it seems that's the case so far with the data. But as we've been saying, that's unlikely to be the case in the younger generations.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was really interesting. Just wondering, has anyone ever tried to correct the data to like overcome those biases that you mentioned? And in terms of the sense, what is the likelihood of it ever taking into account the kind of that you mentioned as well?
Yeah, so to the best of my knowledge, at least in this country, this is quite a new area of investigation. So that actually I think it was just December where they brought out these life expectancy figures for the first time. So before that, we didn't even have any estimates of what the differences in life expectancy were. So let alone corrected for any biases or thinking about any of those things. So that hasn't, in terms of the censuses, so the censuses are there just to measure who's here now. So there isn't necessarily a bias in the census. There's a bias in the calculations. Use that census data when it's not necessarily still relevant, or things have changed since the census. And so there is talk of having more regular surveys to update results from the censuses between census years, so that we can get more up-to-date data and avoid some of the problems in the data that we have. Yeah.
Maybe we'll
Right. That's also quite interesting, right? Like when somebody is born somewhere else and when they come here, you have to have some information to know when were they born, and so on their migration forms or whatever, you take as given, right? And that may not be the same data quality you would have got if they were actually born and had a birth certificate in that same. So yeah, so it may be the case that the ages are not an accurate representation of actual ages, for sure.
Just to follow on from that, Miqdad, has there been one on first generation versus second generation and life expectancy? Because that would show up this kind of change. And also, it would be interesting to see whether you've suggested the salmon effect, or rather the healthy migrant effect, doesn't last beyond one generation. So in some communities, we're now down to 3 generations. Does life expectancy change with each generation that's born in the UK?
So I haven't seen any work on, actually in some of my own research, we're trying to distinguish between people born in the UK and those not born in the UK to try and take account of some of those factors. But as you know, like looking at those key waves of migration, there's not going to be many communities where second generation migrants are at that age in large numbers that they'll be naturally dying. You know, like if you think about kind of life expectancies of being something around 80, right? we're not yet at that stage where people born here who have come in 50s, 60s are yet 80, but maybe the next 10 to 20 years we'll start to see that distinction.
Is there a predictor of this in, say, healthcare use or other anticipation?
So that's exactly the research that we're doing now, is starting to look at what about healthcare use, what about chronic condition prevalence, those kind of things. And so I don't have any results to share as yet on that. And I think there could be interesting other countries, like I think in the US they've had maybe longer histories of migration, that you could look at some of those things. I mean, and you can see, I mean, if you look at black Americans who were brought over as slaves, and now several generations later, they're still dying much earlier than white Americans. And why is that? It's not something genetic, it's because of the way they're treated in society and the opportunities they have. And so
perhaps genetic, the impact of white miscegenation upon a black population.
So, not my area of expertise, the US, unfortunately.
Can I ask a quick question? You talked about the social determinants of health at the end, and the fact that, especially the brown eye experiment, given the fact that education, when you start looking at education figures, it looks like black and minority communities are doing quite well from an perspective, at least at the younger ages. I don't know, I haven't seen the figures for later. What does that seem to show about whether the social determinants are actually in that direction, at least when it comes to education? Of course, taking all the other things into account, I don't know, but specifically on education.
So I don't know the education data very well, but I think you often find people from migrant communities put a lot of focus on education in their children, and they really the children to do well, and they'll take them to extra tuitions, and they'll help them at home, and maybe at the expense of some other things, even like broader opportunities that they may have, and they'll say just focus on your education and all of this other stuff, right? And so that might have something to do with the fact that that they're doing well. And then the other thing is, okay, so this idea of the healthy migrant is also often an educated migrant, and you often find that people who have educated parents, they do well at school, because actually a lot of doing well at school is how your parents help you go through your homework, you explain to you what you should be doing, and so people who are like first generation literate or first generation in university or all of these things, they struggle much more, and it's a much harder journey for them than people whose parents have been educated. And so a lot of these educated migrants will be able to, even if they didn't have a lot of money once they migrated, they still have a lot of this, what we call social capital, to help their children with. And so that might be explaining some of those effects as well.
So just following on from that, does that suggest that the healthy migrant bias may continue in the second generation? Also because if you're saying that they're wealthier to get here, and they're healthier when they get here, then their kids, I don't know the figures, but if your parents are healthy and educated, well, then you're more likely to be as well. So is it what's the justification, or what the evidence to say that a healthy migrant, their kids will also not have that bump up as well?
So they may have some residual effect in terms of passing on some of the educational advantage, but they wouldn't have. So essentially, when you're migrating, you're kind of screening out anybody who's sick. If somebody was sick because they were unlucky, something, they had some condition, because some genetic condition, or they managed to get cancer or something or the other, right? They probably wouldn't be able to make those kind of arduous journeys, right? Whereas the children of a healthy migrant is equally likely to have those sicknesses as anybody else, right?
Not genetic,
but some other, like other illnesses, on average, they've probably got a similar chance to other people in the population. So you're not screening out people or somebody's had an accident in their youth, that might debilitate them and not allow them to progress. And so, but if you're a youth here, you haven't been screened out in that same way. So So a large part of that healthy migrant bias goes away. And actually, I think studies in the US show that it's something that I don't really know the answer to, but maybe when you see an English person, you should ask them.
Thank you, Miqdad, for an excellent presentation. Just two questions. I'd follow on from Iqbal Bhai's this thing. I think there's a lot, we shouldn't really talk so much about the salmon effect because it's only a theory. It's just a way of explaining things. And I note that that was really done because to explain, to also show that there's a ethnicity or genetic bias as well. So there's all these claims or justifications or explanations made. And I think none of those are really stand, but certainly very worried about calling this the salmon effect, because I don't think we have got either it's anecdotal and there's no documentation in terms of analysis, figures, and data. And one's own observation would be that that may have been the case of people wanting to go back and die in the place. But in fact, it was more like I want to go and retire there. And there was a much higher chance of actually dying. But recently, or in recent years, I don't think that's the trend that one knows from a social perspective. So I think it's something that we shouldn't really. I think we should be careful about it, and it should come with a health warning, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
But the other thing I'd like to just an overview is that we spent, at least for me, so many years talking about what the reasons are and what the things are. I think it's time to actually find out what we should be doing about it, and what do you think are the things that the community should be doing to counter that effect. One is to remove the biases and prejudices that are structural, but also what we ourselves can do, and that I think is something that I'd like to hear from you or any other colleague.
Thank you. So I think probably you could tell us much more about these kind of things, and the doctors here could tell us much more about what we could do better. But I think there is often people rush to blame people who are sick or people who are doing worse for doing worse and being sick. And I think, and maybe from a medical perspective that makes sense, but from a social science perspective, people don't always have those same choices or opportunities, or, we might say, why is this person being like this? Or, and if you actually look at the broader context of what opportunities did they have, what were their choices, what else could they have done? Like we could say, why were people going to work during COVID? Well, because they needed to eat, their job was a face-to-face job. They were driving a bus, they were working as a cleaner. If they don't work, they were on a 0 hours contract. If they don't work, they don't get paid. What can you do in that situation, right? Or why were people not properly socially distancing in their home? Well, if they're living in a cramped multi-generational household in a overcrowded slum area, what choice do they have to do those things, right? And so I think thank you. So I think we have to be also careful not to put all the responsibility or blame. And I think that's been one of the kind of features of this government, is that they feel like anybody who does badly, it's their fault. Everybody who does well, it's because of their own hard work, and people who do badly, it's their own fault. And I think that's not always a fair way to treat people. And so maybe there's not so much we can do, and actually it's something that society as a whole needs to come to terms with. That do they think that Black lives matter? Do they think that non-white lives matter or not? And I think that's really what it will come down to at the end.
Okay, final question from the front.
Yusuf.
I didn't get it how basically when the black people were called stupid. They actually turned stupid in the exam.
Yeah.
How is
Not the
that?
black people, the people with blue eyes. Yeah.
Well, but it was like showing back black people.
Yeah.
Like, but yeah. So how did they actually get dumber when
Right.
they?
That's
got
a really
called
interesting thing,
stupid?
isn't it? That just because somebody else called them stupid, they got dumber, right? They did worse on the exam. Just because somebody told them that we think you're stupid, nothing changed inside them, right? Brain didn't go smaller in size or anything. They just did worse on the exam just because other people said that they're stupid. So that's like when you're at school and you call somebody else stupid, that's kind of a bad thing because it's not just making fun of them. It can actually change how well they do on their tests, right? So it's really important to be like nice to everybody and not call them stupid.
Thank you very much. I have lots of questions. If anyone else has any others, Miqdad is around. So I think we'll end there. Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Just a quick announcement in terms of our future lectures. Next week we have Dr Humaira Iqtidar, who'll be talking about Islamic visions of tolerance, limitations, and opportunities. And you'll find out more about our talks on sikkim.org.uk. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.